Hello and welcome to this Chamber Low Carbon live lunch and learn event, Bees and Biodiversity, Key Workers in Our Economy. I'm Chris Gibbons. I'm an Energy and Environmental Advisor with the Chamber Low Carbon Programme. I'm hosting today's session along with Debbie Treadwell, one of our marketing officers. Just got to sting you with a little housekeeping before we formally start. All applicants are on mute. For any questions, please see the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. You could submit questions here throughout the session, and we'll be monitoring throughout the session also, and we'll be bringing them up at the end and to keep everything concise and coherent. If you'd indicate that if you would like to ask your question personally, and we'll unmute you. But Debbie, my colleague, is more than happy to ask the question on your behalf. We also have a chat function, and that allows you to introduce yourself and to say where you're from to the rest of the room. Today's session is being recorded and will be available to watch again on the Chamber Low Carbon YouTube channel. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the programme, we're brought to you by East Lancashire Chamber of Commerce in partnership with North and Western Lancashire Chamber of Commerce, Business-Wise Solutions and Boost. We support businesses across Lancashire to go green, to save money and reduce their carbon footprint. If you could move to the next slide for me, please.
Hang on. Oh, I've seized. Hold on a minute, Chris.
No problem.
For some reason, it's seized because we've moved screens. There we go.
There we go. Thank you very much. Part funded by the European Union Regional Development Fund, this £6 million project provides a free suite of services to help businesses improve their energy and environmental efficiencies, introduce on-site renewable energy generation, and assisting them in saving money. We go to slide 3 for me, please, Simon. The programme also helps Lancashire businesses that are developing low-carbon technologies to bring their products to market, facilitate them being manufactured in Lancashire, and to help them find demonstrator sites within the Lancashire region also. If we get onto your first slide, Simon, I'll just do your introduction.
Okay.
Our speaker today is Simon Cordingley. He is the co-founder of the Bee Centre in Chorley, a multi-award winning organisation which provides a centre of excellence for bee-related education, breeding and husbandry. A highly influential and respected member of our environmental and sustainability community, Simon has over 30 years' experience as an environmental practitioner, consultant and trainer. He's a long-time champion of the circular economy. Simon also has a track record in developing and delivering strategies for economic and social adaptation and resilience. So I'll now hand you over to Simon and he can go through his presentation with you today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to you and Debbie and the Chamber for inviting me to be here today. I'm really pleased to be able to do something on bees and biodiversity for our community. Also, thanks for that really nice intro. I'm not sure where you got that from, but yeah, I'll live with that. We've got lots to cover today, so I'm going to, if possible, reserve questions till the end. Normally, I would kick off by saying how really essential bees are, how important they are in the environment, how wonderful they are as an organism, and what the Bee Centre is doing to help support them. We will be doing some of that later on, but I thought it would be nice to do a little bit up front about biodiversity and look at some of the context that we put bees and other pollinators into. So I did promise as part of this I was going to cover biodiversity and what it is, and to be fair, it's pretty much what it says on the tin. Biodiversity is the diversity or the variation of biological life in a given area, so that could be regional, local, global. It includes things like plants, animals, fungi, microorganisms, and also the communities they form and the habitats which they create. Biodiversity is really very important, and most people don't seem to know why or understand why. It's a little bit of a hidden asset or a hidden value for us. I mean, for example, things like it helps us maintain a healthy and a stable environment, and we all rely on that environment for all the social and the economic aspects of our lives. So in that respect, it supports us. It's our part of our life support system. But it does things like supplying materials. I mean, we get food from biodiversity, obviously, animal matter, plant matter. But things like construction materials, so timber, bamboo, even clean water to use in manufacturing is a result of biodiversity action. Textiles, things like cotton, which don't include microplastics, helpfully, coir, wool, hemp, leather, and so on. We get medicines from biodiversity action. So, for example, aspirin originally came from willow, or was originally discovered through use of willow. Essential oils, herbs generate medicinal value. And in my context, honey, one of our oldest medicines, a very underrated, misunderstood, or not well understood, I should say, and complex product that's really hard to replicate, yet is antifungal, antibacterial, antiviral, and actually is one of the few things that's known to be able to control things like MRSA in laboratory conditions. So, you know, in that context, biodiversity generates really important medicines for us. We also get things like ecosystem services. So, for example, the purification of water in the natural situation, the regeneration of soil and decomposition of waste materials, the purification of air, even something as basic as removing carbon dioxide, a bit of an issue at the moment, from the atmosphere, and creating oxygen, the one thing we all need to live. You know, it comes from biodiversity and obviously in particular plants, and things like pollination. So we get a lot of services that we don't really recognize or value, but are kind of hidden back there. And from a sort of a cultural and a social perspective, you know, we have amenity use. So things like parks, gardens, woodlands, watercourses, all the places we want to go to reconnect with nature, to feel good about life and ourselves, but also to help us with the leisure activities we get involved in, so hunting, fishing, shooting, exercising, cycling, and so on. All those things, we need the natural environment to be able to do in a healthy and effective way. And also, increasingly, we're seeing the value of the natural environment and a biodiverse natural environment in relation to things like mental and physical well-being. And that's been particularly brought to the fore over the last 8+ months with various lockdowns, and how much we realise that we miss the outside world when we're locked away. But other things that we perhaps don't think of as clearly from biodiversity. So there's a lot of innovation that's been inspired from the natural world. Things like, we're doing chamber low carbon, photovoltaics, inspired by photosynthesis, chemical reaction from natural from plants using sunlight. Aerodynamics, the Wright brothers were actually inspired to develop the first powered flight, or the first heavier than air man-powered flight, from the design of a pigeon's wing. The bullet train takes its aerodynamic styling from the bird's beak. Hydrodynamics, low drag swimsuits from shark skin. Architectural design, we've developed earthquake and hurricane resistant and resilient architecture and structures based on the way we understand that trees, being strong, are also still flexible and can move. Air conditioning and ventilation from things like termites and ants. So many Velcro, optics, antibiotics, all of these things come from understanding and recognizing what happens in a biodiverse natural world. So the natural world has been overcoming challenges for many, many millennia, and actually can probably help us with some of the challenges we face at the moment as well. It also adds huge economic value, and we're actually going to look at some of the economic value, particularly in relation to bees later on. We'll look at some stats later on. But for organizations, biodiversity is usually one of the hardest aspects of the environment for them to engage with and address, either through lack of expertise or lack of physical space, or just a perceived lack of return on investment, are all things that quite often put organizations off getting involved with biodiversity. Yet despite the importance of biodiversity, we are effectively destroying it, and potentially therefore losing valuable services, technological solutions, inspirations, and socio-economic value along the way. At the moment, around 1 million plant and animal species are currently threatened with extinction. Now, to put that into context, there are an estimated 8.7 million species on the planet. So that's around about 12% are close to extinction. And indeed, an estimated 150 species every day are actually lost. And in terms of habitats, Since 1900, about 20% of the natural habitat on the planet has been destroyed. And it's this natural capital that actually bankrolls our economies and our social structures. So we really need to protect those more carefully. And in terms of biological protection or biodiversity protection, there are various ways we've done this in the past. I mean, partly because biodiversity is not usually seen as through the economic value lens, it doesn't tend to get as much press and support as other aspects of the environment. And we've routinely externalized it as an environmental cost, and somebody else somewhere along the line will pick that cost up. And as a result, we've tended to rely for environmental protection on the biodiversity and the habitat side from mainly regulation, which, as we know, is typically a failure of common sense, but that's another story which we could go into another day. So, yeah, we've got currently in the UK a variety of regulatory drivers and policy drivers which help support biodiversity. So things like international programs like CITES for the international trade on endangered species. From the EU, we've got things like the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive. And in the UK, I mean, since 1981, we've had the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which introduced triple SIs. We've got a national planning and policy framework, which is well embedded and has been operating for a number of years. More recently, we've got Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act, which was, I think, 2006, if I remember rightly, which requires public bodies to consider biodiversity as part of their activities. We've got the Conservation of Habitats and Species regs coming up to date a little bit more in 2010, and so on, and sort of local nature partnerships, what have you. But all of these have been very reactive, I would say, in their approach. It's more focusing on stopping loss than actually redressing balance. And one of the things that is very interesting moving forward is we now have coming through the environmental bill, which will introduce a number of measures which are rather more proactive in relation to the environment in general and also to biodiversity. So it introduces the concept of biodiversity net gain. We will be looking at biodiversity objectives and reporting and setting specific targets related to biodiversity. It'll look at recovery strategies on a local level. There's elements in there related to trees, but also there's the introduction of the Office of Environmental Protection, which is going to take over a range of duties from the EU and be far more controllable and responsive to UK demands. So actually there's a fairly positive direction in which we're moving. Just briefly, I want to touch on biodiversity net gain because it's a very topical subject at the moment. In fact, it's interesting, back in, I think it was 2006, we had an IEMA conference in Manchester, and of one of the workshops, the least attended workshop was actually one on biodiversity and how we would address it. And I think there were only about 12 people in the audience, 10 of whom were IEMA fellows at the time. And I think at that time we only had about 35 fellows in the first place. It was interesting that the people who were really thinking ahead were looking at that when others weren't. And now it's starting to come through. So with biodiversity net gain, it's driving us towards development that actually leaves biodiversity in a better state than before. And the mechanism by which this is going to be delivered is through a set of scoring programs and quantification, which is complex and convoluted. If anybody wants to know about it, I can answer questions later or elsewhere. But this is actually going to be mandated under the Environment Bill. There will be targets associated with improvements in biodiversity as well. And as I say, the methodology faces some challenges. How do you compare one habitat to another and so on? But it doesn't replace the existing protections, it adds to them and enhances them. And I'm quite positive and optimistic about some of the ways that this will drive us forward. So I just wanted to put a marker in the ground for those people who haven't come across this yet. And for those who do, if you want to ask any more questions later, I'll be happy to field those as best I can, given that we're still going through the consultation and finalisation stages. Okay, so that's a bit on biodiversity. Now, what about bees? Well, if I were doing this in a room, I'd say to you, okay, can you tell me which one or ones of those aren't bees? And actually, as you can probably guess, the answer is those are all bees. Bees are a very, very diverse superfamily. and they fulfill they fill a range of niches in our environment. Globally, there are around about 20,000 species of bee, of which about 10%, just under, can be found across the European continent. And in the UK, we have, well, I usually say 273, but we're certainly saying 271 species. There's various discussions about some reclassifications and so on. But bees are very, as you can see, diverse. The vast majority of bees in the UK are actually what we call solitary bees. And from a pollination point of view, these are really important. Bee for bee, they pollinate better generally than honeybees and bumblebees. But they have a very short range. They have to live close to their forage, and therefore that limits their activities a bit. We've got about 25 species of bumblebees and 1 species of honeybee, and we'll come on to that in detail in a little bit more time. Okay. From an importance perspective, bees, along with other pollinators, are, as you can imagine, associated with pollination. Round about 1/3 of global crop production relies to some extent on pollination, which is largely a result of bee activity. So you hear stories about 1/3 of every forkful of food you put in your mouth comes from bees. That's not in, that's a slight misquote, but they do. Pollinators, and particularly bees, do account for about 1/3 of all crop production globally. To put that into an economic context, around 153 billion euros globally are generated as a result of pollinator activities. Now, these figures are official figures. They come from a variety of sources. If you want to know where they come from, I can give you that later on. I actually would say that these are huge underestimates. I'm going with the official figures. So about 22 billion in the EU, and about a little over 400 million pounds in the UK resulting from pollinator and bee activity every year, which is about 2% of agricultural revenue, or approximately 5% of agricultural gross value added. Now, as I say, I personally think this is quite an underestimate, but it does give you some idea of the level of importance economically that pollinators, and in particular bees, provide. Okay. However, they are facing a number of significant challenges. The National Pollinator Strategy back in 2014 really focused on food and home for bees and pollinators, and that's fine. But actually, there's a whole range of issues that are causing bees to struggle. And you know, at our visitor centre, we get a lot of customers coming and say, "Oh, well, we know bees are struggling." Yes, they are. It's not actually as bleak necessarily as people fear in some circumstances, and some species are doing better than others. But there are still some challenges. So one is forage. Okay, just being able to find food. In the UK, at least, are wildflower-rich grasslands, which are a really important habitat for pollinators and for bees. We've actually lost 97% of those since the 1930s. That's a huge reduction. And generally, we're finding that flower supplies, because bees take pollen as their protein source and nectar as their carbohydrate source from flowers, so it's their main supply of food. Flowers are becoming increasingly scarce. You just got to walk along, you know, the roadside during the middle of summer, and as soon as a nice flower pokes its head through the verge, the local authority comes and trims it off. Although, to be fair, we're now seeing some changes in that approach, and there are good economic reasons to do that as well. But generally, bees are struggling to find good quality and good variety of forage. Okay, so that's one challenge. There's a bit of an issue in relation to somewhere to live. As I mentioned a minute ago, solitary bees need to have habitat very close to where they actually live. Where they feed, you know, maybe 300, 400, 500 yards, whereas bumblebees will probably travel a mile, mile and a half. Honeybees, like the girls on the screen at the moment, actually will travel about 3 miles to forage for food, but they still need somewhere to be able to shelter. And traditionally, honeybees have evolved as a woodland edge species, and they would normally inhabit cavities in wood and so on. And of course, we're stripping back trees and getting rid of dead wood. So actually, now they move into more humanized habitats, artificial trees, chimneys, loft spaces, anywhere where they can shelter from the elements to build comb, raise brood, and reproduce. So it's a challenge for honeybees and other bee species finding places to actually live. Also in the press over the last few years, we've heard plenty about pesticides, and yes, pesticides are a bit of an issue. Since the 1940s, we've had a big push on intensive agriculture, on producing more and more food in smaller and smaller areas, and that has led to land use change, but it's also led to an increased use of things like pesticides. So things like neonicotinoids. Bees have a very complex navigational system, and it gets them to leave their hive and go and travel, in the case of honeybees, 3 miles or so, and come back and find where they're going. Neonicotinoids have been shown to cause problems in relation to that navigational system. So it's a bit like a Saturday night out. You go out, you have a few bevies, maybe you don't find your way home, end up in a hedge or a ditch somewhere. Not that I've ever done that, but yeah, it's the same sort of process. So that has caused issues with colony collapse and other things. But also, pesticides like glyphosate that we traditionally think of as a safe pesticide doesn't directly kill bees, but what it does do is it impacts on the flora, the gut flora, the microorganisms within the gut of the bee. And that can weaken the bee's defenses, nutritional system and so on, and can predispose them to responding in a more challenged way to other environmental or food pressures. So there's an issue there. We've mentioned crops and land use. As I say, since the 1940s, we've actually lost 97% of wildflower pasture lands. Britain's increased continuously, actually, its production since the 1940s of food internally. But that's come with a linked decline in workforce because of the more intensive farming. So around about 80+% of the workforce that used to be agricultural has now disappeared. And over 70+% of farms have disappeared. So we've seen larger farms, more monocultures, more intensive farming, and that has caused problems for pollinators and bees. Bees also have to deal with, as all of us do, pests, diseases and predators, and there's a whole range of ones that honeybees have to deal with. Some are now current in the UK, some are working their way towards the UK. And one of the good things about potentially being able to control borders more effectively come the beginning of next year is we can hopefully get a grip on biosecurity and controlling some of the organisms that actually enter our ecosystems and can cause problems. And we've got a plethora of those that have happened over the last decades that we know of, and probably many that we don't. What else? The wrong bees. Now, here's an interesting one. We have one species of honeybee in the UK, but that species has a variety of subspecies around the world, and beekeepers and bee farmers are very keen typically on producing honey. So they tend to bring in and utilize highly honey productive subspecies. So say, for example, Italian bees or Greek bees, they're very productive in the summer, but as you would expect, they would expect themselves to have a full 12-month forage, which we don't have in the UK. They would expect to have a warmer climate, which we don't have in the UK. We have different seasonality to their normal habitats. So actually, we find that a lot of bees, a lot of honeybee colonies die off over winter. I think the national average at the moment is about 27% losses. At the bee centre, our losses are usually zero, but there's a number of reasons why that's the case, and I'll explain that perhaps in a minute. Okay, so we're not necessarily using or working with the right subspecies of honeybees to maintain a sustainable and robust population in the UK. And that's something that the Bee Centre has been very focused on trying to correct and rectify. Another challenge for bees, funnily enough, is beekeepers. Whilst we have many beekeepers in the UK, and in fact that number is growing. So in 2008, there were about 15,000 beekeepers in the UK, managing just about 80,000 colonies. In 2013, we had registered 29,000 beekeepers. So a significant growth, nearly doubling, with about 126,000 colonies. So we're seeing an increase in beekeepers, but we're also seeing an increase in the continuation of perhaps some historic myths or legends associated with keeping bees. You know, we quite often have new beekeepers come to us. We run really good introductory and beginners programs for beekeepers. A lot of the time we'll hear somebody say, my bees aren't doing what they're supposed to. Well, as an ecologist, I can tell you they are very definitely doing what they're supposed to. They're just not doing perhaps what you think they should be doing, but they are responding to situations out there that perhaps you're not aware of, and they will work in a way that fits with their habit. Okay, so you know, beekeepers quite often will try and get bees to do what they want as opposed to working with them, and we tend to take a more sustainable and ethical approach to beekeeping in that respect. Another thing we quite often hear, well, the bees aren't doing what it says in the book. Well, do you know, the bees don't read the books. There are very few books out there that actually, I would say, are a really good reading in relation to bees. But yeah, they just don't read the books. They will be working as an organism to try and survive and continue. And if we understand what it is they're trying to do, we've got a much greater chance of working with them to help them achieve that. Okay, so that's just some of the challenges that bees face. So what are we doing at the Bee Centre to try and help that? Well, the Bee Centre was set up by myself and my wife, Kath, who's our head beekeeper, with a view to improving the native population of honeybees as one element, but also from an ecological point of view, which is really my background and area of interest, looking at the wider perspective of bees, including bumblebees and solitary bees, and looking at how we can build more robust habitats. And also with my background in environmental management, looking at how we can help organisations to try and address that. So some of the things we do. Well, we breed honeybees based on our native UK black bee. The black bee is fantastic for our local conditions. They are frugal with resources. They pollinate a wide range of native flowers and plants. They are seasonally attuned, so they will reduce significantly, and indeed stop. We've noticed the production of young throughout the winter period, but they maintain a very strong, robust colony. And yeah, so we focus on trying to get good quality bees out in the environment. We've got lots of cunning and devious strategies for doing that. We also promote bees and beekeeping. So we tend to take a very ethical and sustainable approach to beekeeping. We try to encourage others to do that. We focus on bee welfare, and we, as I've mentioned, try to work with bees to help them move forward. Unusual things that we do. The majority of beekeepers and bee farmers typically, not always, but typically, will take the vast majority of honey off in the autumn because that's the focus for most beekeepers. And then they will supplementary sugar feed bees over the winter with processed sugars. We actually are a bit strange insofar as we leave all of our colonies, and we've got a good couple of hundred colonies around Lancashire and North Wales. We tend to leave all our colonies with somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds in weight of honey. Bees still work in proper units. And that actually means that they overwinter well. They have a really good nutritional source, and is one of the reasons why we tend not to lose bees over the winter. We also keep them in particularly good types of hives in good locations, and so on. We run a low interference policy. We tend to avoid chemical treatment where possible, and so on. But we've focused very much on a practical approach to beekeeping. We run education and awareness programs for anybody who wants to listen about bees or to find out more about bees. Oops, just bear with me. So we do this with the public. We have a visitor centre. We've just moved our main visitor centre to just north of Chorley, a place called Cuckoo Gin, Brindle Distillery, where we have a visitor centre. We have a big glass indoor hive. We've got a very diverse apiary. In fact, I think we've got the widest range of different types of working hive in the country in our training apiary. And we will talk to anybody who walked through the door about bees, why they're important, and what we can do to support them. We do a lot with schools, colleges and universities. So we will go out to schools, for example, and do a day or a half day on site with our mobile bees on tour, and help the school to include biodiversity, mini beasts, they quite often do, or environmental issues into the syllabus that they're working on, the curriculum they're working on. We also work with universities and colleges to help them set up colonies. We have a really good schools program where we're working with a local manufacturer of insulation materials to put out reduced cost polystyrene hives with schools and help them build up clubs and hubs and so on. We do a lot with organisations, so moving from things like habitat creation, helping organisations to improve habitat for bees and other pollinators on site. We do a certain amount of offset, so we manage bees on our locations on behalf of others. For example, Lowry Hotel in Manchester, we are working in partnership with them, and Collins Construction, a number of other industrial and commercial organisations. We can help organisations with their CSR. We can build biodiversity into environmental management systems like 14001, BSH 555 et al. And we also run, I have to say, blinding team days, where we look at how bees function, honeybees function as an organisation, as a surrogate organisation. Then we look at what we can learn from them and how we can develop our own organisations. It's, I have to say, I think better than building a bridge across the stream. And people generally, customers go away buzzing, which is very nice. We also run in beekeeping courses, so we run it all the way from beginner through to commercial courses. We're members of the Bee Farmers Association and run programs for them as well. And we do mentoring and provide resources and so on. So we get people engaged. Our catch line, creating a buzz about bees, that's exactly what we've tried to do. We also look at areas that are challenging. Bees, funnily enough, are, after humans, the most studied organism on the planet, yet we know very little about them. I heard that fact recently, or that piece of information recently. I just need to double check whether that's entirely true, but I have heard it. We look at things like bee genetics, absolutely fascinating bee genetics. Their mating and reproduction programs and how they actually manage to reproduce and mate and find mates. Ecology and habitat, pests and diseases, and looking at resilience and how we can maintain more resilient bee populations in the UK. What else do we do? We create habitat. So we do biodiversity enhancement. We work with organisations. We work with an example recently, London Gateway down in Essex, down the Thames, big container port. They had a planning requirement to address bees on site. They said to us, could we go and have a look? We said yes. So we went down there, looked at the provisions that were in the planning, looked at what they had on site, and actually helped them develop and implement a much better scheme that delivered much greater environmental value for significantly less cost than they would have had to do otherwise. So obviously things like that are beneficial to organisations. We help with planting. We work with local authorities to produce pollinator corridors so we can actually encourage pollinators. One of the challenges for biodiversity is isolation. Where you have small pockets of species or of habitat that can't extend, and we help link surveys. We actually do a lot of swarm collection as well for honeybees in the summer, and as I said before, we link to things like 14001 and other management programs. So that's a little bit about what we do. We also do a lot of collaborative work. So from an environmental perspective, we want to try and leverage value with others. So I mentioned Cuckoo Gin. We actually produce the honey that goes into their gin. The gin's won awards in the UK and internationally, and we partner with them to do some promotion of why bees are important through that mechanism. We do things like wedding favours and work with locations that do weddings to encourage people to learn more about bees through things like the weddings. We work with another example, a yellow rapeseed oil, where we pollinate the crop. So we do pollination work. We pollinate the crop, adds value to the farmer because they get an increase in crop and yield. Yellow, as the example on the screen, actually cold press and bottle that on site down at Standish, and we take a certain amount of honey from them. We are weird though, because actually for us, for the Bee Centre, honey production is not our focus. It's almost a byproduct. We're more interested in the environment and the biodiversity side, but rapeseed honey is one of the few we have to take from the hives, because when it crystallises, which it does quite quickly, the bees struggle to remobilise it. So we've been putting a lot of effort in over the last 12 years, but certainly 4 years since we've had a public-facing activity in trying to promote environment, biodiversity, and bees in particular, and we've had some success in that. We're actually unusual in that as an organisation we cover a whole range of different areas. So we do things like, yes, pollination contracts and farming and agriculture and traditional things, and to an extent honey production, but we also do ecotourism, we do education and awareness, we have these breeding programs and so on. So we're actually relatively robust and diverse, and hopefully in that respect sustainable in our own right as well. So there you go. There's a little bit about biodiversity, a little bit about bees, and a little bit about the organisation that I'm currently involved with. Those of you, if any of you do know me, you'll know that I've been involved in environmental management and various parts of the environment profession for 30 odd years. But I have to say, what I do enjoy these days is getting to tell people that I actually make a positive environmental impact, instead of just helping people feel a little bit better about doing slightly less badly, which is kind of what you sometimes think you do when you're involved in the consultancy sector. So there you go. If anybody wants to ask any questions, please feel free.
Thank you very much for that, Simon. So we've got one question in at the moment, and that is, are wasps a threat to bees?
Okay. That's a really good question. They aren't a threat to bees insofar that they compete directly. Wasps are amazing. They get a really bad press. They provide a really important role in the ecosystem by effectively keeping down the insect pest population. But one of the things with wasps is they predate on insect pests. They chew up the meat, they feed it to their larvae. The larvae produce a sugary substance the adults feed on, which is great. But wasps, like all the species of bees in the UK, except for the honeybee, but wasps and bees are separate, but the two are very similar insofar as they typically die off over the winter. And in the case of wasps, they leave fertilized queens around who will set up a new colony in the spring. When they stop producing young, they don't have somewhere to get their sugary fix, so they will rob honey from beehives. But that's usually only an issue when you have a weak bee colony that struggle to defend themselves against robbers. A robust, strong colony doesn't tend to have that problem. It's interesting, with our big glass observation hive, we spent quite a bit of time watching bees coming in, watching wasps trying to get in, and the odd one will get in. And you would think that the bees would bundle the wasp, have a go at it, and overcome it by force, by numbers. But actually what we find is one bee, one wasp, the rest stand around cheering, and when the bees killed the wasp, the others will dismember it and run around with legs and wings and trophies of various sorts. So no, they're not competitive in that respect. They have different ecological niches, they have different food sources, they have different shelter and accommodation requirements. But when wasps are dying off in the autumn, they will try to rob honey from beehives. There you go.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Firstly, we've got a thank you very much, Simon. Do you have any scheduled courses available at the moment? Obviously, what's the situation in regards to COVID? And if so, when are they planned? or is it all
Okay.
updated, all the information on your website?
Well, certainly information is and will be on the website. Yes, things have been a little bit interesting this year for us, like many others. We do a number of ways to start getting involved with bees. One of them I haven't mentioned yet is actually our what we call a bee experience, which is a multi-award-winning activity that we do, where we will get customers kitted up in a beekeeping suit. We throw them to the bees for an hour or so with Kath, our head beekeeper, and you get to be out there immersed with them, seeing how a colony functions, looking for all the bits in there, looking for the boys, the girls, the queen, looking at the young, and so on. Very interesting, very absorbing activity that we do. That lasts about an hour, and then we do about half an hour on bees, habitat, and honey tasting inside. So we do that. That's a kind of an introduction. We also run beginners courses for people who are interested in beekeeping. We focus that on our sustainable and ethical approach. Normally, when we publicise them, we're sold out very quickly. This year, for example, back at the beginning of this year, we had 5 courses sold out, and we do a lot of training. We 5 courses sold out within 2 days last December. They were scheduled for the lockdown period, so we end up rescheduling them. And we typically run 1 to 2 courses a month. We keep the numbers low, so actually, hopefully, the COVID thing won't restrict us too much in the future. We tend to run about 12 people at a time. And we have just listed open vouchers on our website, so you can actually buy a voucher without specifying a date and then use it before the end of October next year, because let's face it, we don't really know what's going to be happening with restrictions and lockdowns, but we will be providing some specific dates in the next 2 to 3 weeks ready for next year. So for people who do have something in their diary or who want to get something in their diary, we'll be doing that as well.
Okay, that's brilliant. I can't see any more questions that have come through at the moment, so I can pass over to Chris.
Yeah, so it doesn't look like we've got any further questions. I think that's the strength of the presentation.
Either that or everybody's asleep, Chris.
Sorry, Simon.
Either that or everybody's asleep.
No, I don't think it's the latter one. I certainly don't. Definitely a good buzz about the place anyway. I couldn't help myself, could I? Just to wrap up before we go, everybody, if there's no further questions, I'd like to thank Simon for his time and expertise and insights today, and for everybody for your attendance. I'm sure there's quite a lot that we can all take away from today's presentation. Hopefully it'll be some vouchers to get in there when things are a little bit back to normal and you can get to the Bee Centre. On a final note, if you want to find out about our future events, or where we would list future events, if you use the chat function, I think we've put some of the details in there with the links to the website or the Eventbrite site. We also have a range of resources on the Chamber Low Carbon website in terms of anything that's sustainability, energy and environmental considerations. Please do have a look at the website and do get in touch with us if you have any questions. And please sing us loud and proud on social media channels that we've now got on the screen. It would be very helpful. And one final thank you, and keep safe and well. And we hope to see you soon. Goodbye.